Buenos dias. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
So I was telling some of you yesterday, and I was telling Steve, explaining that we started this tradition almost shortly after we opened the university. One day that I think it was, we were talking to Andy Morris, and some were trying to talk about some theories and typical classical liberal discussions, and he was coming back to literature, and we thought, okay, let's talk about literature. What is your favorite book? And in his case was Heinlein's The Moon is a Harsh Mistress.
Yeah.
And said, could you give a talk about this? And we decided that every time we have a special invitee, and especially when we have honoris causa, we should do that. We should speak about the favorite book. So we asked Steve about his favorite book, and he wrote me back saying my favorite book is probably The Last Unicorn by Peter Beagle. I didn't know the book. I don't know the book. And I asked like 30 people, hey, do you know this book? And everyone said, no, I've never heard of it. So we are all very intrigued, Steve, and thankful to you because of having a book as favorite book that no one else knows. So Thank you for bringing it to us.
Okay, thank you very much, Gabriel. And it's a great honor, actually, to be able to talk about this book and to introduce what I truly believe to be one of the great works of 20th century literature, actually, to a new audience. And the fact that Gabriel asked 30 people and none of them had heard of the book tells me that he doesn't know anyone who reads fantasy literature. Because amongst readers of fantasy literature, this book is extremely well known. It is ranked, Locus magazine, for example, ranks it the 5th greatest work of fantasy ever written. It currently is in most polls of fans of fantasy literature. It comes in at about 12, certainly, or even higher. And also, it has achieved the fate of popular fiction, which has become recognized as a kind of literary classic, and it's been now made the object of a secondary literature, and Palgrave, former Macmillan, has actually included it in a list of what it calls the canon, the modern canon, and it's now got the fate of having a large volume of secondary critical studies attached to it. So what is this book? Well, it was written in 1968 and published in that year. The author, Peter S. Beagle, is quite a well-known fantasy author. He's written a number of other books that are well-known, but this is undoubtedly his masterpiece. And the book, to be clear about it, is a literary fantasy. That is, it's not a Tolkien-style epic fantasy with quests and saving the world from a renaissance Dark Lord, nor is it an even more or less a grimdark fantasy of the kind that's currently popular, where you have morally compromised characters who are living in a very dark and grim world of pain and suffering, nothing like that. And it's also nothing like another top popular genre at the moment, the genre of romantasy, about which said the less the better. Rather, this is a literary fantasy work, and again, in contradistinction to much contemporary fantasy, it's a standalone book. It's a relatively short book. It is completely self-contained. It is a self-contained narrative and story, which I'll very briefly expound to you in a moment. And it's therefore not part of these publishers' trap motif of buying one book and then discovering it's book one in a 21-book series with more yet to come, which is the kind of currently dominant mode of publication in that genre. So the novel begins in the following way. This is one of the greatest opening sentences, in my view, in contemporary fantasy literature. The unicorn lived in a lilac wood, and she lived all alone. She was very old, though she did not know it, and she was no longer the careless colour of sea foam, but rather the colour of snow falling on a moonlit night. But her eyes were still clear and unwearied, and she still moved like a shadow on the sea. And that, in a way, gives you an idea immediately of the quality of Beagle's prose, the poetic use of language. Now, what is important to say also is that in this book, as you will find when you read it, there is not a single word or metaphor that is out of place or unintentional. Every single word that is in just those initial two sentences, for example, is there for a very precise reason. The allusion to sea foam, for example, the mention of sea foam, the mention of the eyes of the unicorn, her moving like a shadow on the sea, that is a crucial kind of forecast, if you will, of what turns out to be a central point in the plot of the book. And what that opening also does is to establish two central things about the unicorn. She's immortal, she's very old, she's timeless, and she lives all on her own in a wood that her presence enchants. And you then get a description of her life in the wood, and one of the points that's made is she's living all alone, but she knows that there are other unicorns elsewhere, and that's all that she needs for company, we are told. And then one day, two hunters enter the wood, and they say to each other that they have no chance of finding anything because since there is a unicorn that lives in the wood, the legends say, then nobody can catch any of the animals under her protection. But then the two hunters say to each other how there are no unicorns left in the world. If there is one there, she must be the only one left. And this disturbs her tranquility. And she's now bothered by the thought that all the other unicorns have somehow mysteriously gone and only she is left. And so she leaves her wood and she sets out on the road to try and find out if any of her fellows are still alive or around. And what she discovers is that magic has departed from the world. The people that she meets on the road do not recognize her for what she is. Instead of seeing a magical creature, a unicorn, they only see a white horse. They try to capture her, they try to turn her into a draft animal. And she then meets a butterfly, the first creature she finds that actually talks to her. And the butterfly, initially talking a lot of nonsense, then tells her that all of the unicorns have gone because they are being pursued by a creature called the Red Bull. Shortly after this, she comes into contact with a carnival run by a witch called Molly Fortuna. And the carnival purports to be having lots of magical creatures in it. And Molly Fortuna, unlike everybody else, recognizes the unicorn for what she is. She captures her, puts her in a cage. And like all magical creatures, she fears the touch of cold iron, which means that she's therefore confined by the iron bars of the cage. And she realizes that all of the other creatures in the carnival, with one exception, are just ordinary creatures that Molly Fortuna has made to appear as though they are magical and fantastical creatures. The one exception is Kalano the harpy, whom Molly Fortuna has captured as she's captured the unicorn by accident. Also in the carnival is an incompetent and completely useless conjurer or magician, Schmendrick. The name is deliberate. Schmendrick in Yiddish is a man who has reached the limits of his incompetence, basically, a kind of useless individual. And Schmendrick is a completely useless magician. He can't do anything. But he also recognizes the unicorn and he frees her, and they escape from the carnival. Then, while they're still making their way down the road looking for the Red Bull, they're captured by an outlaw called Captain Cully. And in a wonderful passage, Captain Cully and his band of rogues, Schmendrick confronts him and said, "Oh, I know about you. You're well known, Captain Cully. I know how you and your chief henchmen met each other and beat each other up with quarterstaffs and then became, lifelong friends." And then it says in brackets, Schmendrick had actually never met or heard of Captain Cully, but he had a good grounding in Anglo-Saxon folklore and knew the type. And so, in other words, Captain Cully and these men think of themselves as being like Robin Hood and his merry men, but they're a kind of poor, washed-out imitation of them. However, then, Schmendrick accidentally suddenly awakes the magic within him, and he evokes a kind of pageant of the actual Robin Hood and his colleagues, his merry men. And they parade through the camp, and Captain Cully and his men are sort of heartbroken and rush off after them, trying to find them. And then Schmendrick escapes along with the unicorn and also with the paramour of Captain Cully, a woman called Molly Grew. And as they go down the road, they then meet the Red Bull. And the Red Bull terrorizes the unicorn and is about to drive her well, we'll find out where in a moment. But then, again, Schmendrick suddenly has an access of magical power, and he transforms the unicorn into a human woman, a mortal woman, Lady Amalthea. And they then end up in the land of the villain of the story, King Haggard, who rules over a narrow, crabbed, pinched, mean-hearted, mean-spirited kingdom by the sea. He lives in this castle. He is by his own, apart from his adoptive son, Prince Lear. And they seek refuge in there to try and find out, because they've discovered by now that the Red Bull actually serves King Haggard, and that he is the one responsible for the disappearance of the unicorns. And while they're there with him, they are baffled by the complete inability they seem to have to find out what is going on. But at the same time, Lady Amalthea is gradually losing her memory of being the unicorn. She's becoming truly human, transformed in that way. And then they overhear King Haggard. King Haggard confronts Lady Amalthea and tells her he knows she's actually the unicorn transformed, and he shows her the sea breaking on the rocks below the castle, and he reveals to her that that is where the unicorns are. That's why there's the allusion to sea foam in the first sentence. The unicorns have been driven by the Red Bull into the sea, and the white foam on the waves as they break on the rocks is actually the embodiment of the unicorns that have all been bound by Haggard's malevolence and spite in the ocean. And at that point, Schmendrick and Molly Grew then know where they are. They go out, but then what happens is the Red Bull again confronts them, and it now attacks Lady Amalthea, the transformed unicorn, and she falls. He's about to kill her, and at this point, Prince Lear, the son of King Haggard, he confronts the Red Bull, but the Red Bull injures him. And at this point, Lady Amalthea is transformed back into the unicorn, and she drives the Red Bull into the sea. And as the Red Bull retreats into the sea, all of the imprisoned unicorns burst past him, and they sweep away King Haggard's castle, and they go in all their separate ways to the places where they'd all lived. And at this point, Schmendrick has now become what he had never been before, a true powerful magician. The magic, as he sees the sight of Lady Amalthea Prince Lear lying there dying, and Lady Amalthea transforming into the unicorn to defend him, he is filled with magic, and it says in the book, he had not known he was so empty to now be so full. It says in the future he could never do even the smallest magical work without seeing in his mind the image of the unicorn standing over the body of Prince Lear. He then brings Lear back to life, he heals him. And at that point, the end of the book is that they all go their separate ways. But the crucial point that is made is that the unicorn is now transformed. She's no longer the careless creature she was before. She has now known mortality and her life as Lady Amalthea. And it is not clear that she's going to be able to go back to the wood and be truly at home there the way she was before. And meanwhile, Schmendrick goes off with Molly Grew, and Prince Lear has sadly gone back to try and restore the hard, crabbed country by the sea that King Haggard, his adoptive father, had ruled over. So what is this book actually about? In one sense, it's a fairy tale. It's a narrative of a fairy tale with many of the stock figures of the fairy tale narrative. This is deliberate. But it's also about something much more deeper and profound. And what makes it a work of genius, in my view, is the way in which that profound narrative is combined and woven into a story which can be read and appreciated by somebody of any age, using, as I say, beautifully polished and spare language and all of the motifs of the fairy tale. And essentially what the narrative is about the disenchantment of the world. The way in which in modernity and the modern world, the feeling of magic, the feeling of transcendence and immanent magic in every aspect of the physical world has been lost or removed by the forces of what you might call utilitarian modernity, as personified in the person of King Haggard. And the point about this is that it's an ultimately futile and soul-destroying activity. King Haggard takes no joy or pleasure in anything other than the sight of the captured unicorns. That is the only thing that makes him happy. His life otherwise is one of grim misery and lack of content. You might say he is the bad guy in the story, but in fact, in many ways, he is a pitiable figure, but he is the representative of the forces that have transformed the world so that nobody recognizes the unicorn now for what she is. They only see a horse, a mare. They no longer see the magical force that she represents. But at the same time, What the book points out is that true appreciation of the transcendental or the immanently magical, if you will, is only truly reached through awareness of the nature of mortality, the ephemerality of our own lives, and the way in which they are constantly lived on the edge of destruction. So in the world through which the unicorn and Schmendrick travel, there are only, if you like, shadows or faint echoes of the magical world. So Captain Cully and his men sort of like LARP the world of Robin Hood and the romantic outlaw. But in fact, that is, according to the narrative, a kind of higher reality, if you like, a kind of platonic reality, which they are somehow imitating. And what Schmendrick does with the vision he conjures is to create that and make it more apparent. The Carnival of Molly Fortuna has all of the magical beasts, a dragon, a phoenix, various other magical creatures, but in fact, these are simply transposed upon the earthly, the reality that she is evoking through magical tricks. But none of this is real. But what unites the transcendent, the world of the magical, with the world of the mundane, the physical, is, it's pointed out finally in the end of the book, the experience of mortality and of loss. That is what makes it possible, the argument of the book is, for all the time-bound mortal to appreciate the nature of the transcendental and perpetual immortal world that is symbolized by the imprisoned unicorns and the last unicorn. It is only through awareness of the apparent death of Lady Amalthea and Prince Lear that Schmendrick is able to suddenly become what previously he has only been a kind of weak imitation of, a truly powerful magician. And it's only through that that the Red Bull, which represents the kind of force of chaos and sheer force, can be banished from the land. And so there is much more in the book that I could talk about, particularly the use of various metaphors, images, forms of language. You could, if you are a literary scholar, then this book is almost inexhaustible in terms of the way you can talk about the tropes and use of words, expressions and metaphors within it. But at that point I will simply end by saying that this is a book which is both a brilliantly constructed story, but also a work of profound and deep meaning, which combines the two in the same way that its own plot does. And so I think you should all read it, and you should all, I'm sure, appreciate the text once you read it. I recommend this edition particularly, by the way. I'm very glad we got this one, because it has a wonderful introduction by another very good fantasy writer, Patrick Rothfuss, which he describes what he got out of the book. I should say that Patrick Rothfuss suffers from what is a regular disease amongst contemporary fantasy authors, which is an inability to complete his series. So he's written a trilogy, and he's so far written 2 parts of the book. The third part we've been waiting for nearly 12 years now. So this appears to be a common malady amongst contemporary fantasy authors, it's fair to say, known to the aficionados as Martin's disease. After George R.R. Martin, one of the best exponents of it. But that's one of the reasons, again, why one of the great advantages of this book is it's a self-contained book, which is not part of anything larger. But nonetheless, for that, it's a great work.
Thank you. Thank you, thank you. I was trying to telling a tale to my son, and I wrote a book of 300 pages about a history similar than that, but with duendes. I don't know the word in English. Y shanas. I don't know the word in Spanish. And but yes, I like fantasy literature a lot, and I enjoy how fantasy tells us how to live our lives. Yes, this is.
I wanted to ask you another question. If the whole motif is the losing of the enchantment of the world, why is that a bad thing?
Well, the feeling, what comes across is the idea that with that something profound is lost, and the people who see the unicorn and think she's a mare, or Captain Cully and his band, they are lacking something which would make them more whole, if you will. They are trying to follow the kind of myth or image that they know, but they can't actually realize it, because they're detached from it. But the point is that they know that something is lacking. And so the argument is that there may be gains to be had, Although if you read about King Haggard's country is also impoverished. But the problem is that people have lost something which is an essential part of their nature, of what it is to live as a full human or person. But they're not really aware of it. They are aware. They know they've lost something, but they do not know what it is that they have lost. And this is a common motif in fantasy, by the way. It's the same is true in Tolkien, for example, and that's why a lot of fantasy has an elegiac quality, which is that it's set in a world of decline.
Well, building on that, there is a sentence to say that at some point, I forgot his name, but he realized that he didn't know he was so empty. And I really like that, this idea of a discovery. So I think indeed it's probably a very inspiring book in terms of your own journey and how, as you say, something is missing, but until you see things differently here, turning into a magician.
Yeah, precisely.
Then you don't know. And this probably could be applied to the world of ideas as well.
Yeah.
I mean, your understanding of the world and...
Yes, indeed. You may think, well, I know I don't quite grasp something, and the grasping of it is on the edge of my consciousnness, but then suddenly you have that experience where you come across an idea or an insight where it suddenly all makes sense, and you suddenly realise how much you had not really grasped things before once you have that enlightenment, so to speak.
Great. Oh,
yeah, sure. I was reminded, have you ever read that chapter by Chesterton on the ethics of Elfland?
No, I haven't, no.
Oh, it's a wonderful little chapter. I can't remember if it's in Orthodoxy or Heretics, but he's really complaining exactly about this. And apparently that chapter really influenced Lewis and Tolkien to write fantasy. And I think he starts wonderfully by saying something like, his cosmovision is someone like Robinson Crusoe, who's just wondered by everything that's in the world. And this sort of magicality of things and the miracle that things actually happen. Now, of course, he's going to take it to Christian theology in the end. Yeah. But he's making a good defense of the importance of the magical.
Yeah.
Do you think that this book can be transformed in a movie?
It has been made into a not very good animated adaptation. It can only be done through animation. I don't think this is a book which lends itself to... Maybe you could do it with CGI. I don't know if somebody's thinking about doing that, but you certainly couldn't do it with physical actors and things.
You said at the beginning something interesting. You said that people usually don't read fantasy.
Well, I think the people that Gabriel has met clearly don't.
Okay, the people that you know. Why? Why is the reason? Because our life changed when fantasy is over, when you discover that Santa Claus and all those kind of things doesn't exist. So change totally, because you live around magic is different than when you don't know the magic doesn't exist. So why there are many people who are not reading or watching movies about fantasy?
The interesting question is probably why in the modern world does fantasy still exist as a genre? Because we live in a world which I think is antithetical to the fantastic. We live in a world where the belief is that the only true knowledge is knowledge that can be measured. This is a very profound superstition, I would say, of the modern age. If something can't be expressed in numbers, if it can't be measured, made concrete, then it's not real. This is a very common kind of notion or idea, not least amongst some economists, I would have to say. Not economists who've read Friedrich Hayek, of course, but many others. And there is also the idea that essentially a kind of very naive version of empirical materialism is very dominant in philosophy, the idea that only the material is real. No philosopher takes this seriously, but this is something that is pervasive in our kind of popular culture. And so the question really is why, what is interesting and revealing, I suppose, that you have the persistence of the fantastical, the fantasy, within this world. And that's why it exists as a major genre. And it takes different forms in different periods. So in the Victorian era, the main form it took was that of the literary fairy tale, which was a major genre of Victorian literature. People like George MacDonald, for example, famous Scottish author and divine, who wrote several wonderful fairy tales, The Princess and Curdie and The Princess and the Goblin, the two main ones. William Morris, the famous, again, 19th century artist, socialist intellectual, and others, he also wrote a whole series of fantasy novels. In the 20th century, it translates and transforms into different forms. The fairy tale, not so much, although this book actually is essentially cast in the form of a literary fairy tale. But that's unusual. These days it's more either heroic narratives, as in, say, Tolkien, or it's in the form of the sword and sorcery novel, which is a kind of adventure story but set in a fantastical world. Yes, in Robert E. Howard. So the interesting question really is not why do people not read fantasies? Why is it that in the world we live in, which has, as Max Weber said, been systematically disenchanted, stripped of the idea of the fantastic, why do so many people still read it? And I think what that tells you is that for many people, at any rate, there's a kind of profound need, if you will, that is spoken to by the fantastic narrative. It's a way of thinking about the world that still has an enormous kind of power in many ways. I'd say, by the way, the other book I thought of putting on was, in fact, The Lord of the Rings, and I thought, well, everyone knows about that, you know. People know what that book is, but one of the things to say about that book is that although almost all the people who follow Tolkien construct heroic narratives, which are all about a hero myth, one of the main points of Tolkien's book is to subvert the myth of the heroic, because the main character in the trilogy who is a hero is Aragorn, who has all of the typical features of the mythical hero, which is deliberate. Tolkien knew what he was doing because obviously that was his academic study. So he gives Aragorn all of the classic tropes of the hero, but he's not the main figure. It is not he who destroys the One Ring. It's Frodo and Sam, the two hobbits. And one of the main themes of the book is the limitations of heroism and the importance of the quotidian, the everyday, the domestic, as the source of true virtue, basically. And that's why the book ends the way it does, with one of the great classic closing lines of English literature. So again, you know, there are many, many works of fantasy which speak very profoundly, I think, to all kinds of questions in a way that perhaps a lot of contemporary mainstream literature does not.
I am from the north of Spain, from Asturias, and in Asturias there are a lot of little tales. Nobody's perfect. No, nobody's perfect. There are a lot of little tales and also legends and also fantasy literature. For example, Palacio Valdés, La Aldea Perdida, is a great book. But the thing is, in my opinion, all the fantasy literature in the northern Spain is about identity, how to discover your own identity. And the second thing is connection with nature. Because in some sense, all the fantasy literature in northern Spain is a reaction against industrialization. Big factories, miners, and discover the relation with nature. It's really interesting how through fantasy you discover yourself and your identity.
That's a very common theme in much fantasy literature. And if you think again about Tolkien, one of the major themes, which he explicitly puts in his letters of both The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, is reaction against modern industrialism and the rest of it. What you've got a lot of, though, what you also found developing in more recent fantasy in many parts of the world, is fantasy, that so-called urban fantasy, which actually takes the industrial or modern setting, but imbues it with the qualities of the fantastic. And so that's the kind of movement away from that bucolic and rural, anti-modernist, anti-industrial fantasy, which is, you're quite right, is the very dominant theme of a lot of fantasy in the first two-thirds of the 20th century. So we've seen a mention of that. I'd add, by the way, that fantasy literature is not only confined to, or primarily found, actually, in Europe. The civilization which has the longest tradition of the fantastical in literature is China, in the shape of what are known as wuxia novels, or so-called swordsman stories, which are stories about knight-errant kind of characters who are martial arts experts, who travel through a kind of mythical version of China, fighting evil power and righting wrongs. And It's still an enormously popular genre now. The authors in this genre literally sell regularly hundreds of millions of books, and they're like major figures. Of course, the reason why it's not appreciated is because very few people in the rest of the world can read Mandarin or the other Chinese languages in which this text is done. There's also a similar tradition in the Arab world, but again, that is not known to Westerners. So this is a kind of human universal literature. It's a form of literature, a form of narrative, which you find in pretty much every civilization or culture on the planet.
Just a comment related with this. In fantasy books, we usually find enchanted forests, but not enchanted cities.
Yes, although that has changed, I think, in some ways. The idea in many fantasy novels, there is the idea of the fantastical city, and that actually has become quite a common trope. You can think of it as saying The Wizard of Oz, where Dorothy and her 3 companions are going to the Emerald City and this kind of thing.
I wanted to ask a question. I thought I heard a hint to Game of Thrones in your initial exposition. And one of the reasons I wanted to ask is I know a lot of the students watch Game of Thrones. I've watched everything. And I know there's a lot of fantasy. We love watching dragons and wizards and so on. But one of the things that I think is very different, perhaps from that book and also from other fantasy, is that there's no moral compass in Game of Thrones.
I don't agree with that. Let me. This is a common reaction. This is a very common reaction. Yeah. George R.R. Martin is the kind of founding figure for what this subgenre called grimdark fantasy, which is fantasy where you have, as I say, morally compromised or morally ambiguous characters, and you're living in a world where there is apparently no moral compass. You're living in a world which is actually pretty close to hell. It's a world where might is right and things of that sort. But if you actually, and for the world of people like, say, the British author Joe Abercrombie, I think, who's a very good writer, by the way, I think this is correct. That's not true, however, of Martin's own world. But when they did the television adaptation of it, they took his narrative and because they didn't quite capture the internal point of view narrative that the book is built around of several of the characters, they lost the point. What Martin is saying is not that there is no moral compass, there is no right or wrong. There clearly is in his books. And it's clear that several of the primary characters, Jon Snow, Arya Stark, others, have indeed got a very powerful moral compass and are conventionally good and heroic. The point Martin makes in the book, though, is that the world in which they are is a world of brutal competition through force. And so one of the themes of the series of books is precisely the challenge or the difficulty of realizing or achieving virtue in a world that is highly morally compromised. But he's not saying that therefore this is a world with no moral compass. But that doesn't come across in the TV adaptation because, well, they did lots of things to make it more attractive to an audience, such as lots of totally gratuitous and unscripted sex and nudity, for example, which annoyed the hell out of me. I mean, it's not in the book. There's no need to have all this going on. It doesn't add to the plot. It's just there to titillate teenagers of all ages. And but more recently, they've done an adaptation that's going on at the moment of another series of novellas set in that world, about 100 years previously, called The Night of the Seven Kingdoms. And in both the novellas and also in the TV adaptation, which follows the novellas almost perfectly so far, that is very clearly a world where principles of honour and moral compass apply and are important. And the two main characters, Dunk and Egg, Sir Duncan the Tall and Egg, his squire, future king, they're clearly moral characters who are doing their best in this world they're in to achieve or do something to promote virtue. So I think that that's actually a popular misconception. If you actually read Martin's books, that's not the case.
Steve, thank you for sharing The Last Unicorn with us. Mm-hmm. And thank you all for...
And all buy the book. You all need to read this.
Yes, I guess there will be a spike on the selling of the book starting today.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. So,